in the back of the program, and I'd like to say that I'm not afraid of Linda Freeman. I've always been inspired by Linda, and and she does have a style that is worth emulating. Let's not say it's scary, but as a professor, you do well to emulate Linda in the classroom and in your office. This meeting is very reminiscent of a series of meetings that Dave Black and I held, 20-something years ago, where we had a small grant and we had this dream that we could. Roger Southall asked earlier if there was such a thing as a Canadian anti-apartheid movement, or some kind of connected network, and Dave and I were of the naive belief that there was. And that we could all get together in the run-up to the end of apartheid to reflect on what we had done and where we were going and so on. And over a couple of days at Dalhousie, we brought many of the people in this room together, and a few people who aren't in this room together. And it was members of civil society and the private sector and government, and for 2.5 days you fought like cats and dogs. Which is very interesting, because this has been rather cordial, and I keep waiting for the gloves to come off. I don't know, Fred had a comment right at the beginning. I thought he was going to set the tone, but we've been very polite. We're living up to a Canadian stereotype, and maybe we want to sort of take one step beyond that stereotype and call a spade when we see it that way.
This time you've gone too far, Larry.
Won't be the first time, John. Yes, so this session, as you see in your program, it's called Lessons from and for Solidarity Politics in Southern Africa. In the run-up to the planning, originally the previous session was going to be, as you saw, transnational. Then there was going to be one on sort of Canadian focused, and then this one was going to be originally, as conceived, was going to focus on voices from Southern Africa. But people come and go and so on and so forth. So we've mutated into a panel that it's really, I think, a continuation of the last panel, where we've got 4 people who were active in various ways in the struggle, and what we've asked them to do is to speak from their own experience about what they did and how and to ask themselves what worked, what didn't work, and then also to then reflect on, what have you taken forward in your present day activities. If not presuming that you're still an activist, but if you are, were there things to really have drawn on from those days that are particularly useful in the struggles that we face today. We're going to go in the order of panelists that appear on here. So we'll start off with Zeb. Each panelist has 10 minutes. I'm going to sit down there, and then I'm going to go like that, and that'll mean 5 minutes. Okay? And then after 10 minutes, I'm going to walk up to the microphone and turn it off. Okay? All right. So Zeb, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Is the mic on?
Yes, it's on.
Has to be really close.
Good afternoon again. I'm going to digress a bit from the topic, and I think Larry talked about that a little bit. What I'm going to talk about a bit is I'm going to talk about some of the grassroots engagement that took place, in Canada. And so I'm going to talk about the fundraising that was done for the ANC in Canada, starting around mid 80s. I was asked, by the ANC in Lusaka to set up a direct response unit in Canada to raise some funds to help with different things that they need to do, as well as help support the mission, the ANC mission here in Canada. So I said, wow, you don't have a registered charitable status, so how are you going to raise funds in Canada? So in any case, somehow we managed to scrape up about $5,000 for the initial campaign, and we started the initial campaign, and we raised $40,000, without having to issue tax receipts and so on. And I was floored. I almost fell off my chair when I saw a check of $5,000 from the Sisters of St. Joseph out of London, Ontario. So that was the beginning of the fundraising that was done here in Canada. I have to say that there was only 2 countries that were successful in raising funds from the grassroots in the world, and Britain by far was really a place that was able to raise a lot of funds. Secondly, it was Canada, like there was the Scandinavian countries and so on that helped, but more it was on the government level, and it was not on the grassroots level. So, the experience there was really good. What I'm just thinking, I was thinking about it, and I was talking to Larry about this the other day, that had we had social media at that time, it would have been just fantastic, because at that time all what you could do was direct mail, and which is pretty expensive, and social media would have helped a lot, in raising the funds, So that was a lesson that we learned, that if you do the right target, the right people, and so on, you will be able to raise funds. In late 1989, I got a call from the ANC in London to say, in London they have set up the Nelson Mandela Reception Committee. And they said, we're preparing for Madiba's release from prison, So I mean, I knew there was talks going on and so on, but I didn't realize that it was going to be that quick, And so I said, okay, and they said, you should set up one in Canada as well, So I met with some of the friends and so on, and we got the Nelson Mandela Reception Committee off the ground. We had churches, unions, and even students involved in it and stuff like that. And the day Madiba was released from prison, that evening we were able to have about 5,000 people on the Danforth, celebrating his release, and it was a cold day, I remember very well, outside. But again, if there was a social media and so on, we would have got many more people, because this was just in one day. We just made a few phone calls and so on, and we were able to get about 5,000 people out there. So, and also 4 months later, Madiba came to Canada, and the Mandela Reception Committee hosted 2 events, one at the Collegiate in Toronto. I can't recall the first part of the name of the Collegiate, and it went really well, especially, he wanted to talk to young people, and that was a platform that he had where he spoke to young people. But the next, on the same day or the next day, we had an event at Queen's Park, and that we had many thousands of people that turned out for the event. That was the Nelson Mandela Reception Committee. Again, it was done again by students, and that we had done. I'll skip another one, which was called AMSCO, which was the ANC Mandela Support Coalition, where people were just trying to support the ANC and so on. But what I also want to talk about is that in 1992, around November or so, the black trade unions in the US held a conference in New York, and I went to attend that conference, and at that conference I met Billy Medici, who was the chair of Matla Trust, which was given the job by Nelson Mandela and so on, to train people about voter education and so on. So again, got together with some friends, and I know Ann Mitchell was part of it as well. And it was an ad hoc committee, and we started raising funds in Canada, and we partnered with an NGO, which again was able to get close to about $500,000 from Partnership Africa Canada, which I think was part of CEDA at that time, also. And again, that really was a very successful, a grassroots initiative, because most of the funding that came was from the grassroots. Then after the elections and so on, the next step was that we need to do something, and to help with the development and so on. So we then got the idea to set up a Canadian Friends of the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund. And fortunately, while we were getting it registered, Mandela was coming for a state visit to Ottawa, and we got in touch with people in South Africa to arrange for him to come to Toronto. And somehow we were able to mobilize the communities, school boards and all that, and we were able to have an event at the Sky Dome with 45,000 children. And this was called Madiba and the Children event, and it was really very successful. Kids, wrote some real good, what they learned from that visit, what it meant to them, and all that kind of stuff. That book is still around. And then recently, we have the Mandela Legacy Canada, which Walter is involved in, and we celebrated the Mandela Day, which is a day that the United Nations has set up, and also we were then able to work with some councillors in Toronto to get University Avenue dedicated to Mandela. So if you go to the corners of University Avenue, you'll see University Avenue, but on top of it, it says Nelson Mandela Boulevard. So, so that, and it's right from Queen's Park right to the lake. So I think I'm going to stop at that point. I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the grassroots engagements.
Right. Thanks very much, Zeb. Thank you. I think that you raise a good question about whether social media, would have helped or hindered, right? And I think that's something that we could more broadly think about. But also branding. You're trading on Mandela's name, and these sorts of strategies for activism. It's quite interesting. So Stephen, the floor is yours. 10 minutes, please.
Thanks. So let me just start with a little bit about my own personal history. I arrived in Canada from Cape Town, where I grew up, in 1976, a few months after Soweto, as a very young and probably very naive undergraduate student at U of T. Already politicized, though, partly because of my upbringing, but also because of the Soweto uprisings, which had happened just a couple of months before, while I was involved in protesting around that in Cape Town at the time. After a few weeks in Toronto, I stumbled across Ticklesack, who were hosting a day event of some sort at St. Paul's Church, and so I went along to that. And that sort of then became, in a way, not just my political home, but also very much my community while I lived in Toronto for the subsequent 5 years. in the last two of which, the first three were volunteer in Ticklesack, the last two I worked full-time in the office as a political activist. I then moved out to Winnipeg, as I think David mentioned, to do my PhD in economics, and participated for 3 years in the Manitoba Anti-Apartheid Coalition, which at least therefore gets a mention here today, which is good. A regional anti-apartheid group. And then went back to South Africa, supposedly to do my PhD research, but arrived back right at the moment that the UDF was formed, and that sort of public protest starting in the Vaal Triangle exploded in March of 1984, actually just a few days after I got there, although I'm not claiming credit for it happening. But spent the next several years essentially working with the trade union movement and the churches in South Africa, to some extent with the UDF as well, trying to bring to their work the economics expertise which I'd acquired as a student here in Canada. Firstly on the matter of sanctions and disinvestment and what that might mean, how they could take a political position, and then as we sort of got closer to the point of transition, looking at future economic policy and wider economic analysis. And part-time at that point I was assisting people like David with the work that Oxfam was doing and other Canadian organizations. So, and then after the beginning of the 90s, my involvement in the Canadian anti-apartheid movement ended, but I was involved in other issues in South Africa. But having said that, I want to make, I guess, 3 points that come out of my experience, two out of my experience as a Canadian activist, and then as a South African activist in South Africa, but with a Canadian heritage, if you like, and formation and connection. Because having come here so young, I was very much formed intellectually and as an activist by my experience in the anti-apartheid movement. And the first point that I want to make is that I think the Canadian anti-apartheid movement, if you look at it sort of comparatively across the anti-apartheid movements in different Western countries, the Canadian anti-apartheid movement very much punched above its weight in terms of making an intellectual contribution to the anti-apartheid movement and to understanding of South Africa globally, not just about Canada, but globally, I think. And I think it's in this context that I do want to just refer very much to Linda's work, because Linda was very much, I think, part of that, what I would call the intellectual heft that the Canadian anti-apartheid movement had, way beyond its numbers. And John, of course, was very important in that as well, but in Ticklesack, at meetings, we would have 10 or 12 people with PhDs in African studies sitting around the room discussing the nature of South African politics. And for me, as an undergrad there, it was a key moment in helping me to become a social scientist and an economist. And I think that the work that was done in Southern Africa Report, in other vehicles and media and so on, and in the books that we wrote as a movement, I think we made a very important contribution. I mentioned, I think Linda's work was very important. I think her location here in Ottawa was also very important. The fact that in Ottawa, here at Carleton, you had somebody who was very seriously engaged in the anti-apartheid movement and able to challenge the Canadian government and understand what they were doing, but at the same time to challenge them to go further, was a very crucial contribution. And her book, of course, is a testament to that, a sort of summary of the overall contribution that she made. But many others also did, and I think, in fact, I would argue that the work of Ken Lockhart and Brenda Wall was also important. We may not have agreed with they did an important history of SACTU, which I think made a contribution. And it was odd that that was done in Canada, but it was done in Canada. Pierre Baudet did an important book in French out of Montreal as well, Understanding South Africa. So that's, I guess, the first point. The second point, and Larry's already told me I'm halfway through, but the second point I want to make is really to link the Canadian boycott and other campaigns to actual dynamics, political dynamics in South Africa. And it was really only after I went back to South Africa in the mid-80s that I began to understand what we had been doing in Canada around sanctions, disinvestment, and so on, and boycott campaigns in a deeper way. Because at that point I was asked by the unions and by the churches to help them figure out a way in which they could deal with the criticism that these pressures, economic pressures on apartheid, were actually hurting their own members. So they wanted to support sanctions and disinvestment, but understand the economic consequences. And at that point, I think what became evident to me was that the anti-apartheid movements in Canada but elsewhere faced, I think, quite a fundamental dilemma. Because on the one hand, it was important to promote things like the fruit boycotts that we heard about earlier, the wine boycotts and so on, in order to get support within Canada for the politics that we were trying to campaign for. But we also had to recognize, but did not, I think, enough in Canada, recognize that these campaigns did not have much of an effect in South Africa itself, in terms of shifting the country towards the moment of liberation. The economic process and campaign which was most important in this regard is the one that Moira Hutchinson referred to, which was the bank campaign, which we sort of stumbled into in Ticklesack and around Canada almost by accident, because that was one of the few connections, economic connections, between Canadian business and the apartheid regime. But as it turned out, the bank campaign was the most important outside economic pressure in moving South Africa to the point of liberation. Because of the macroeconomic effect that the ending of the bank loans in 1985 had on the South African economy, and pushing South African business in particular, and ultimately the de Klerk government, to open up to democracy and negotiations with the ANC. We didn't understand that, I think, and I think that as Moira pointed out, we had very little impact in some ways on this, except that we did raise some consciousness around that, because these were market risk decisions that the banks made to stop lending to South Africa. However, the dilemma is that without the boycotts of the fruit and the wine and so on, the moral campaigns that we waged, would the whole issue of risk and the banks' decisions really have been on their own agenda? To what extent would they have been on their agenda? So it's quite hard, I think, to separate these two issues. And I'll end, do I have any more time? Because I just want to end with 1 minute on my current work, which is not about South Africa, actually. I'm now based in London, and one of the places I'm working in, and I also kind of fell into by accident, is Myanmar. And I've been working in Myanmar for the last 2 years, during which the country's gone through quite a lot of transitions, including, in some ways, a democratization, not hugely different to South Africa, and facing many of the same sorts of challenges that South Africa faced in the mid-90s. But of course, in the last 6 months or so, Myanmar is sort of back in the headlines for very negative reasons, and that is the campaign by the military against the Rohingya. And in my own work and in the organization where I work now, we've had to really think very carefully about the ethical and moral dilemma that we face. Should we continue to do our work in Myanmar, which is intended at least to promote development, poverty reduction, economic growth, all these sort of goods in the country, and which are sorely needed in that country? Or should we withdraw, as some people in our organization believe, because of the what some people call ethnic cleansing or genocide, the humanitarian disaster that is the attack on the Rohingya? And the ethical, the ethical dilemmas and political dilemmas that we face, the way I've worked through them has been very much influenced by my own sort of trajectory in working in Canada and then in South Africa around issues of boycott, sanctions, and so on. I will explain more if people want afterwards.
Very nice. Thank you, Steve. That's two people who stayed exactly on time. Thank you very much.